was filled with guns and war. Everyone got trampled on the floor. I wish we'd all...
Okay, everybody, welcome to Music and Mentorship. This is another one of our podcast / YouTube recordings that we're going to share with you guys. And today's album that we're doing, by the way, I'm Jay. This is Matthew. We're the ones who do this podcast, and our special guest for today, who's been our special guest for the last few episodes, is Joseph. All of us are serving as missionaries currently in Uganda, and you'll probably get to know us more and more as these episodes go on and kind of get to know who we are. Today's album that we're going to be discussing is one of my recommendations to these two guys, and it's an old one. Was it done before you guys were born? It was put out in 1999. Y'all were already born. Okay. But how old were you when this album came out?
I was like 3.
Okay.
I was 7.
Okay. So this album is called, Larry Norman is the artist, and the name of the album is The Vineyard. It's actually a live concert that was done at the Vineyard Church in California. It was recorded on March 21st, 1998, and it was released in 99. Larry Norman, the artist, said that this was his best live album that he ever put out, which wouldn't seem like a huge deal to many people, but Larry put out over 100 albums in his career. And so for this to be the best one, I think, and for him to say it was the best one, I think is significant. This album is important to me I don't know so much that it's the album, though the album is really insightful and I love it. But one of the reasons why I love this album so much is because it takes me back to a really cool experience that I had around maybe 1995 or 96. I was living in North Carolina and serving at a Christian camp there, and a bunch of us got together and we went to a concert. And we really didn't know who was going to be playing in the concert. We just knew they were having a concert. We kind of wanted to check it out because we were a little stir crazy staying on the camp. So we all kind of hopped in a couple cars and drove down there. And at the time, unknown band named Third Day opened for somebody else that we didn't know. And this is before Third Day was big or anything like that. They were still opening band, which now they're, most everybody, even in the secular world, knows who Third Day is. But they were young, and we had some cool conversations over their merch table and stuff. And but the star of the show was this old guy named Larry Norman, and I guess he seemed old to me. He probably, now that I'm older, he probably wouldn't seem as old. But Larry did this really strange set. It was mostly acoustic. He did half of it was acoustic and half of it was electric. But I had never seen an artist like this before. He kind of had this like hippie, almost like beatnik poet vibe, but yet with this kind of rebel rocker attitude. And as I listened to his music, like he had some guts, man. Like he was calling out some things that no one else in Christian music had ever said before, at least in my hearing. He was calling out a lot of the hypocritical things within the church, but he was doing it in such like a kind, gentle, hippie-like way, And my ministry, up to that point and even to this day, is very prophetic and can be very strong and harsh sometimes. And as I looked at Larry, I thought, I would love to be a prophet that speaks with love like Larry does. That, he says these hard things out of love for the church and out of love for the members of the church, the members of the body. And so I actually bought an album there called Children of Sorrow, and you can't buy it anymore. You can't get it. It's out of print. But whenever I got my hands on this album, The Vineyard, it just took me back to that experience. And so this is the closest thing that I can give you guys to help you experience what I experienced in sitting there and listening to, this long-haired, hippie Christian artist really impact my life and many others in that concert. So just a little bit of information. In this album, you can see a lot of Larry's unique personality, and he is a unique character. He's a little strange, but you really get that taste of it because he has these interactions with the audience and things like that kind of show his personality. But it also shows his uncomfortable relationship with the church by some of the things that he said, and even some of the things he said to the audience and the ways that they interacted with each other. You can feel that uncomfortable nature that he had kind of been walking in for more than 40 years. He also deals with a lot of uncomfortable topics in this album, things that the Christian church, specifically at that time in the 90s, didn't want to talk about. Things like feeding the poor and our responsibility to do that, things like the end of the world, romantic relationships, like looking at it from a Christian perspective, the illusion of the American dream, he deals with that. And all kinds of other like hypocritical things and inconsistencies in the Christian worldview at the time. Like he's just laying them out there, but he's laying them out there in such a kind way that you're like, you're not offended by it. You know, you may disagree with him, but you still feel, I guess, admiration for him. An interesting thing, I read a quote about him the other day as I was kind of prepping for this, and it was from a letter, and he described himself as a satirical surgeon trying to remove an ugly cancer from the church. And I thought, yeah, that kind of sums it up for me. And he did have a purpose for these songs. These weren't just songs that he wrote, you know, to get rich or, you know, to make himself famous. Like there was a purpose behind this. And I feel like in a lot of ways, at least in my life, it worked, you know, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to pass it on to you guys. I wanted you to be challenged in the same way that I was by some of the topics that he addressed and how he addressed them. Two other things I want to share about this album. One is there are a lot of imperfections in the album. Like it's a live album, but it's really raw, and it shows like even sometimes there's a couple times he's off key. There's sometimes that he forgets lyrics, but I think that's what's so endearing about it. Like I love the fact that it was real, you know, and it wasn't like, because a lot of times in live albums today, what they'll do is whenever there are imperfections like that, they'll take it back into the studio and they'll fix it. But like you get to see all the realness here, and you can really see, you know, the real Larry Norman, not the produced version. Another interesting thing that I read, and then we'll move on to the next section about this album, is that the original album that came out had like a section in it about Compassion International that you could like tear out. You could write and basically ask for more information. And Compassion International is, you know, I think most everybody, oh, you're wearing a shirt. So Compassion International is specifically an organization that helps underprivileged children around the world. And this was like Larry Norman, one of his biggest things is he really pushed Compassion International everywhere he went. And it's interesting because back in the day, whenever I was growing up, most of these Christian artists had something like a little tear-off thing on their cassette that you could fill out and you could get in contact with one of these organizations. It was kind of their way of taking it beyond just the words that they sang to these organizations. This is how you can be involved. And I thought, you know, that'd be really cool if groups started doing that today. You know, if there was an organization that you believed in and you put their stuff out there and, you know, you motivated people to get involved as well. And I think that was something that was really prominent in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, but maybe we've lost today. That would be cool to see come back. So that's my you know, introduction to the album and why it was important to me. But now it's time for you guys to share with me, like, what were your thoughts? What are your initial impressions of Larry Norman's The Vineyard?
So first impressions, I really appreciate Larry Norman being as fun as he is. As you said, he's kind of a gentle hippie, but at the same time, most of the ideas that he's sharing are not gentle ideas. They're not about gentle subjects. They're about very serious, sometimes sharp subjects that pierce society, or he is sometimes asking them to pierce society when society is not dealing with things. I would call Larry Norman a Christian Dr. Seuss for adults. He is witty. He has some phrases in here that I can mention later, but he's witty. He's even whimsical at times, but his whimsicality is not without purpose. He always says things that make you think. They're silly things, but they're also serious. So I really appreciate his lyrics. I think the album as a whole, the lyrics are strongest. The musicality is simple in that it's just his voice and a guitar, or his voice and a piano on disc 2 is more piano. I think he has a lot of skill in guitar and piano, but I think the most deepest impressions that I had or from the lyrical impact socially and society and politically.
So before you pass it, let me ask another question. Did you prefer the first disc, which was guitar and voice, or did you prefer the piano and voice?
I think musically I probably prefer the disc 2 because I prefer the piano. Lyrically, there were more songs on the first disc that were attractive to me and just poignant in the way that they were addressing specific societal issues.
Cool.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and answer that question too. Disc 1, like 100% was my favorite. Just as I was listening to disc 2, throughout it, I felt like almost getting bogged down. And I was like, man, this is also really long. And then I realized this is literally a full concert that Jay has given us to listen to. So it was pretty cool though, because you also get a variety of his music, stuff from the mid-late 60s up through the 90s. So
it was 40 plus years of songwriting that was packed into that concert.
Yeah, so once I kind of got that in my head, I was like, okay, I'm listening to a live album that's sort of like selected songs from his entire discography. I was like, okay. I just tried to, take it in a little bit differently. I really liked the first disc. As a whole, I was surprised. It wasn't exactly what I expected. I think when you first told us to listen to the album, you mentioned, or we said, like, well, what should we expect? And you said something like, I don't know, think like 60s Christian Americana, and like added all these different words together. And in my mind, I was like, so maybe Bob Dylan-ish? And then we listened to The Outlaw, and I was like, okay, yeah, I can do this. This is sort of like Bob Dylan. But the whole album, for me, it became less and less like that. Because, of course, he's his own person. He's writing his own music and stuff. But I think, honestly, I had higher expectations lyrically, and then I was a little disappointed as I listened to it, especially because I loved The Outlaw and If I Were a Singer, which are the first two songs that we listened to for like a sort of first reaction kind of thing. Overall, I thought there were some really solid gems in the album. And I even went back and listened to the original versions of several songs because I wanted to hear the full version. I noticed that he had been skipping lyrics or like changing lyrics, and so I wanted to see how that compared. But overall, I really like Disc 1. Disc 2, there might have been 3 or 4 songs that really stood out to me. But those ones that did so pretty powerfully. So he's quirky. I mean, what was the thing he was doing? He was like making all these weird mouth sounds, and it was like he was singing the guitar parts, and I was so confused. At first, I was just like, what is he doing? And eventually he referenced it himself. Yeah. He said, it's in the album. It's in the recording. It's a guitar solo. Sorry, I got to do it real quick. And he just sings it, and it's kind of quirky and weird. But I think you guys are right. It's a little bit endearing because you realize, okay, he's a human. He's weird and quirky and funny, and he's not afraid to kind of be himself. It wasn't all produced, and it in one sense, of course, was professional, but like in another, it didn't feel as if he was trying to pose in front of everyone, and so I really appreciated that.
Cool. Yeah, I think that the produced albums, like, they come off completely differently, like they really do, and you sense some of the age from like the late 70s and late 60s and early to mid 70s, those initial albums, but like a lot of the weirdness is taken out, which I think is good sometimes. And that's why I really debated whether to give you guys this album or to give you another one of his albums, because you would have had a completely different experience.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I felt like what I want them to experience is not necessarily the album, but the person of Larry Norman. Like, that's what I want you to experience. And I felt like that's what really impacted me as I got to know more and more about him. And he's not perfect, believe me. There are some pretty glaring, issues in his life and his ministry. But, like, isn't that like all of us? And I feel like that in most cases he dealt pretty honestly with his issues and with his, eccentricities and sinful behaviors and those types of things. And so that's really what I wanted you guys to experience. And I'll share with you guys later, like the albums I would recommend, because there are certain songs in this that, like, if you were to hear the recorded version, like the produced version of that song, you'd be like, this is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the versions they're not as, overpowering, I guess, or like overwhelming, so cool.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else you want to share?
Not specifically about first impressions. I mean, the only thing I noticed was, as we were listening musically, like, he had almost an identical picking pattern throughout some of the songs. And then he just changed the words. He changed the chord progression and he changed the words. And so in one way I was like, come on, man, like, do something different. But at the same time, it kind of created this, like, bass line that allowed me to listen to some, I mean, kind of hard-hitting lyrics sometimes. Like, he was very aggressive towards Americans and the government and people and Christians in general. And so I ended up appreciating that by the end. But yeah, I'm glad that we did listen to the live album, because I think you're right. We got to focus more on him and not on the production and whatever musical style was popular at the time.
I think that picking pattern, specifically with the classical guitar, it's a very Woody Guthrie. Dylan does it quite a bit, and it's basically to give you this driving progression so that they can basically poetically state. It's more of a poem at that point than it is a song. And so, I love that, because you can do several songs in a row. And I think even in the piano, he did the same thing. He did with the piano, he played something, and he played 3 or 4 songs just with that same progression on the piano, which I thought was interesting. So,
yep.
Cool. Well, tell me about the high points. What do you feel like were the high points in this album?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. I think, as I said before, disc 1 overall was my high point. Disc 2, there were a few songs specifically I really enjoyed. I actually really liked "And We Sing the Tune," which is one of his love songs. And I was surprised it was so short. After some of his other songs have been 4 or 5 minutes, it was like 2, maybe 2.5. And I wanted to hear more, and so I was kind of bummed when it was over. But the other song on disc 2 that I really liked, where was it? "I Hope I See You in Heaven." I enjoyed that one a lot. But as far as disc 1 goes, I think some of the main high points for me were when he was willing to say stuff that either was, I won't say aggressive, but maybe controversial, or maybe, not maybe, it was convicting, And so right out the gate, "Feed the Poor." I think one of the lyrics in that song was, "What are you going to say if Jesus asked you why you didn't?" And just sort of these reflective moments of, what are we doing? And he wasn't afraid to say that. And so I really, really respect him for that. Some of the other songs I really liked. I really enjoyed the duo of songs. They were back-to-back on the album, God Part 3. I don't know what God Parts 1 and 2 are, but God Part 3. And then that flowing into The Great American Novel. I thought that those songs were really, really great. Lyrically, God Part 3, there's a part that says, "I don't believe in politics while the masses stay unfed." Again, more this feed the poor kind of idea. But then he says, "Till the leaders change priorities and supply the poor with bread. Don't believe in the revolution or the empty words of peace. You can tear all of the governments down. You still won't find release. But I believe in God." And so that whole song is him talking about things that we put our trust in, things we put our hope in, and how he's saying, no, that's not going to fill us up. That will not be what we need ultimately. And then he ends every verse with, "But I believe in God." And I found that really powerful, especially in our culture, and I think any culture in the world, but coming from an American perspective, where we're always looking for the next thing or the next system or the next political party or next product to fix whatever problem we feel like we have.
Yeah, and I think that it's especially important right now, because we do have issues in our country and around the world. There are some major issues with things that are going on. And, I feel like one of the really cool things about Larry Norman and some of his, friends that, were singing and doing these stuff, that whole Jesus movement that came out of the late 60s, is that they were all about let's do something. But their what let's do something had this core value, which was Jesus Christ. Like that was it.
Yeah.
And I feel like today, this generation wants to do something, but they don't have the core value. And so whenever the difficult times come, there's just like this blurriness to everything that's done, to every injustice that they speak out against. There's never any absolute anything. And so it ends up basically just falling away. And you're like, well, whatever happened to that? 2 months have passed and it's already gone. And I feel like that just that focus, I believe in God. Like that's what it comes down to. Like that is the center of everything, not just the belief, but what comes out of that belief drove the Jesus movement to actually do something.
Exactly. Because he's not saying, oh, I believe in God, so everyone throw your hands up, like it'll get all figured out. No, he's saying because I believe in God, we have a responsibility to do this and this and this, right? And that our faith in God should lead us to action. And like how I think in 1 John, John writes this idea of brothers and sisters, let us not love in mere word or speech, but in action and in truth. That's what I feel like he's trying to communicate. But he's not like really throwing this sort of Christianese language at you. What he's talking about is more of a, he's talking about political stuff. Honestly, he's talking about social stuff. And so, yeah, I really enjoyed that song. And I thought that flowed super well into the next song I really enjoyed, The Great American Novel, which, Joseph, I think you like that song also, right?
Yeah, I did. I did like that song. I think that, like I said, the disc 1 has some really powerful lyrics there, has some really powerful songs and messages that he's sharing politically. Before I talk about the songs, I wanted to talk about some of the phrases that I thought were really fun but purposeful and pointed. Just some of these quotes that I took down. You have been the art, the film, the fashion of the music that I hear. He says, acid rain falling from on high, when he's talking about if the bombs fall, I still love you. Strong love and strange peace, talking about the strong love and strange peace of God. I've never heard God's peace called strange, but it's very appropriate. And then probably my favorite is Jesus fished because we floundered. I love that one. And everyone laughed in the audience in the live version. I thought that's in the song No More LSD. So
I love that song.
Yeah, it's a pretty good one. So I really, like I said, I really appreciate the piano. There's a little bit of honky tonk going on in this too with the piano. I happen to like that quite a lot. And then this one, there's so many songs that I really appreciated, like Reader's Digest. I appreciate that one. It's talking about the illness and rock and roll. And he's criticizing people that are criticizing rock and roll. He's criticizing the status quo, the culture wars, the church. But he also goes back and criticizes people in the 60s and 70s who were this new wave of, no one's exempt. He's criticizing Christians and non-Christians, and he's criticizing who you might call maybe traditionalist and new wave of culture. So they don't escape. There's this issue going into disc 2 with dance. There's several songs and spoken words, and just when he's speaking, talking about dance. David danced before the Lord. What are you going to do with that, church? And he's really teasing out this idea of dance, and so I appreciate that. Then there's, as Matthew was saying, the outlaw, and if I were a singer, lyrically powerful, very political. The government, relationship between the government and Jesus. Jesus is seen as like a vagabond, but he is also a holy man, and he's a prophet, and it's just a mix of images about Jesus. Then The Great American Novel, I feel like he was contrasting orphans and free. He mentions that in one of his starting lines. He says, filled with grain and an empty spoon. So talking about the silos are filled with grain and an empty spoon in America. This whole song was powerful, as Matthew already mentioned a bit, because he's calling up the legacy of America. He's saying soft words about killing black men and talking about adultery. These are very serious issues, He's calling out the evil of that white people, that white supremacy has made, rich people over poor people, and those he's talking also, those people can't seem to understand. It's not just that they're not changing necessarily, but they don't really understand what the issue is, he's saying. It's really a whole story of, the great American novel. It's not that he's saying that, I don't think that he's saying America is the worst, it's terrible, we should give up on it. No, I think he's saying America has existed in a certain way in our minds, and that way is flawed, and let me show you the flaws.
I think specifically he's pointing out to the church the inconsistencies of what we say and what we do. And I don't think he's holding necessarily so much to account the government as he is the church.
Right.
And so I think this might be a good time for us just to take a quick listen to maybe some of that song, and then we can continue our discussion.
I was born and raised an orphan in a land that once was free, in a land that poured its love out on the moon. And I grew up in the shadows of your silos filled with grain, but you never helped to fill my empty spoon. And when I was 10, you murdered law with courtroom politics, and you learned to make a lie sound just like truth. But I know you better now, and I don't fall for all your tricks. And you've lost the one advantage of my youth. You kill a black man at midnight just for talking to your daughter. Then you make his wife.
Something else I loved about this song is, he does deal with a lot of these hard issues. Like he deals with racism, nationalism, war, politics, and all of it's a little hopeless. It's almost like, well, we're in a mess. But then the last line of the song, totally brings it home. Whenever he says, I guess it says something about, people are looking for answers, but I only have one. A man leaves his darkness when he follows the sun. And that's just like bringing it home and bringing it back once again to Jesus Christ. Like, this is it. And I think that in all this stuff that's going on with the terrible things that are happening around the world, but it's specifically in the United States, it's in the news all the time. This idea that we can solve it with social justice, I think, is foolish. The only way that we can solve it is by really focusing on these spiritual issues within ourselves and within those that we surround. And the interesting thing about the Great American Novel is this was spoken to the church, and he was like, these things exist there. We have to address those things because social justice, it's part of who we are as a church, like your shirt. Act justly and love mercy. But that can only come out of the purity of Christ's love for the world. Whenever it's tainted by politics and by agendas, then it doesn't last. But I feel like in this song, he's bringing it back. I don't have all the answers, but I do have one. A man leaves his darkness when he enters the sun. And I read something else from somebody who was talking about how whenever they became a Christian, they realized that the racism that they had in their heart couldn't live in the same body as the Christian faith. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's powerful. Very powerful. Another song I thought was powerful was God Part 3. He's talking about revolution. He mentions government. He mentions art. He mentions research. And then later on, I believe in the song, If I Were a Singer, he talks about writers speaking to readers. So he's attacking artists as well. It's not just bring down the government or this establishment. He's connecting this idea of artists even back to the dance, back to the rock and roll, back to the 60s and 70s and the people who were coming out. And he's saying art, Christian art, people who are Christians and who are artists, people who are not Christians who are artists. This is all part of this, too.
Yeah, I think kind of going on what you guys are saying about how he's speaking specifically to the church, there's a moment in the album where he's not singing, he's just kind of monologuing, doing his thing. He does that a few times. And he says, I quoted what he said, or pieces of it. He says, I just want to look like Jesus. I don't want to be like the church. And we are the church. And I don't want to be like you. I don't want to be like me. I want to be like Jesus. I'm too much me. You're too much you. Get over it. So I wrote this song so I don't have to discuss it anymore. And the next song was, Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music? Which I thought was pretty funny, but also fun and a neat reflection on also like the sort of Christian cultural moment of those years where it was like, don't you dare listen to the radio, rock and roll's of the devil, like things like that. To see how that has changed over time, and you have bands like Stavesacre that we listened to a few weeks ago. You have bands like Petra. You got Larry Norman, but you also have like traditional worship groups, if you want to say. I really appreciated how he wasn't afraid to, like you're saying, he kept going back to, we need to look like Jesus. We need to be like Jesus. What does that mean? It means to be steeped in the Word of God. It means to know God's character and know God's truth more than human preference or rules or tradition in that sense. Not that there are things inherently wrong just because something is traditional, but like, how does it match up with Scripture? And are we upholding the laws of man to the detriment of the Word of God? He's not afraid to say stuff like that to an audience full of people, and I respect that a lot.
And an audience full of church people.
Right.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I think is really interesting about Larry's perspective, and it always it gave me insight. Larry would say things like, all beauty belongs to God, like the arts belong to God, and part of what he felt like his mission was reclaiming that from a world that has tainted it.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of his music and things like that is like, hey, there's nothing wrong with rock and roll music. We just have to reclaim it
Mm-hmm.
so that it brings glory to God in some way, so that it continues his mission on earth. And I thought that was really cool. Like, that's a cool way of looking at it, specifically that all of the arts, all things of beauty belong to God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And even whenever they've been stolen and taken into a bad place or a different direction, like, we have a responsibility to reclaim that. And I feel like we see that throughout this, both through poetry and singing and dance and all these different things. We see him trying to reclaim something that belongs to God in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a lot about high points. I guess we had a bunch of them, but I got to throw out some of my low points here.
All right, let me see if I have any more high points to throw in.
Okay.
Yeah, I do have one more, or
Go
two,
for it.
maybe two more. The songs musically, UFO and 666.
Yep.
Like, I loved them musically. Now, theologically, I would probably not be necessarily in the same ballpark, and I don't focus that much on end time stuff. But that was a huge topic back then. But
Mm-hmm.
musically, I think they're both two very beautiful and unique and interesting songs. The other thing that I wanted to share, and I think they were high points mostly, was his banter with the crowd.
Yeah.
Like, I absolutely loved it. You know, he had a conversation with a little girl named Hannah.
Right.
You know, just some little girl, you know, and, you know, he has a conversation with another kid that starts crying, you know, he puts the kid in the song, you
Mm-hmm.
know. So there's all kinds of little cool things like that. And those were high points for me. The part where there is a part in the album where the audience begins to clap.
Yep.
And they're
Mm-hmm.
clapping kind of off on the on beat instead of the off beat.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing happened in the concert I was at. The exact same thing. So I think it was like a major pet peeve for him whenever people clap during his music. Because, I mean, whenever I heard this album, I was like, this must have been recorded this, but evidently it happened frequently.
Right.
And, you know, that, honestly, it made me feel a little bit uncomfortable.
It was awkward.
Yeah.
Because he didn't just stop once. He stopped the first time. He's like, why are y'all clapping? You're doing it wrong. And everyone kind of laughs. And he plays, and they start clapping again. And then he's like, no, you think I'm
not joking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's okay, man.
Yeah.
You do you.
But I also think that also shows part of his personality. You know,
Sure.
in artists, they're like that. Like, they want it a certain way, and like, don't mess with the art that I'm putting out there. You know, don't screw it up. So anyway, let's hit low points.
Yeah. So low points for me. Honestly, I think the first note I put about it was on UFO, which I liked as a whole. I'll say it. But at the end, I mentioned this earlier, he starts doing this weird voice thing, and I was like, what is he doing?
Okay, at the very end of the song.
Uh-huh.
Okay, that's from a movie.
Wait, what? Okay, maybe I'm mixing parts up. Explain
I don't
this
think
to me.
so.
What
Okay,
is
so
this?
that's from a movie. Like,
Mhm.
what's the movie? It's like Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And so this
Mhm.
the sound that he makes there at the end is like da na 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 na. Is that what you're talking about?
No, well, there's that, yeah. But I'm talking about, in general, how he was making all these noises with his mouth.
Okay.
And we talked about it earlier. He said that, oh, this was on the
Oh
recording.
yeah.
But I'm going to do it anyway because he wasn't going to skip it. That annoyed me. It just did. I couldn't get
agree.
through it.
That was my huge low point for the whole album.
Yeah.
In fact, that's what I wrote.
Uh-huh.
Every single time that he sings or hums
Mhm.
a guitar part or a banjo part, it's just distracting.
Right.
And I think that I understand, like, for an artist, in his mind, the song is not complete unless it has all these parts in it. And so I think in his mind he was trying to do that, but it did not come off well.
Right. It
don't
just
think.
seemed a little awkward for me. And it was, okay, I know the guy's quirky. I know he's funny. He's just talking with the audience. But that, for me, took away rather than added. I was wondering, well, why don't you just have someone playing lead guitar there? Like, where is the electric guitar? I wasn't sure if it was supposed to be a guitar or a banjo sometimes because of the way he was making sounds. And so it'd be one thing if he just sang
Like the
the
melody.
notes, the melody, yeah. But he
tried to make it sound like a
Stylize it.
guitar or something.
Yeah.
And yeah, I agree completely.
like he had like a whammy bar sound at one point, and I was very confused. But also at the same time, I appreciate it to an extent because it characterizes the whole experience. So, but it bothered me overall. So that was definitely a low point. You mentioned it before. There were several times where, especially on the piano, he was way off. Like he played several chords and then would consistently play it, and it was just wrong. And maybe it was right, but it didn't sound right. And so maybe that's how I wrote it, but it sounded just like it was really clashing, and so that bothered me a little bit. Maybe not so much a low point, but I think it's funny. You mentioned that No More LSD is one of your favorite songs. I only put 3 little notes on there. I said, this is pretty cheesy. It reminds me of Petra sort of lyrics and like the whole take a chance with Jesus sort of line. And so it's funny that you like that one because it fits still in that like 80s lyrical genre
I think
a little bit.
I think the reason I like it is maybe different than what you expect.
Okay.
Because once again, knowing his history, like did you hear the song "Love on Hate Street"?
I did. Yeah, that was
So
in
do
there.
you know what that is? You know what Hate Street is?
No, explain that.
Hate Street is in San Francisco, and it's where the hippie movement began.
Okay.
And he lived there, like he grew up there, like
Mm.
that's where. And so he literally was like right there, where all this hippie stuff came up. And whenever he came to Christ, he was trying to share the gospel with these people who were, drugged out and whatever. And so the reason I loved it is partially because it really fit the way that music was back then. And you could tell that basically he had formed music to be able to evangelize people who were right there in his backyard. And so I think my love of it, even though I do like, it's really quirky and I think it's fun, but my love of it is because I think this is a really creative way to evangelize.
Okay.
And so once again,
Yeah.
it's not like he was saying, hey, we need to do something. He was like, let me do something,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And probably his most popular song, which is not on this album, unfortunately, is called Look Into Jesus. And it's a very similar type thing, but, it's addressing some of those issues, but it's an evangelistic song. And so I think that's really kind of why I like the song. So
Interesting. Okay. See, I didn't know that backstory stuff. So that helps me understand it. Personally, I still was like, I don't know how I feel about this. So, and the other low point, honestly, was the last 3 or 4 songs were really, really short. But I actually really liked them. And I was wondering, why are you cutting these short? So, and we sing the tune, If the Bombs Fall, Endless Life of Dreams. I was wondering why they were so short and why you cut it off. But also, at that point, you're getting close to 2 hours on this album, and he was probably tired.
he's probably reading the audience too.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, but those are some of my lower points.
think my low points are the musicality is repetitive. There is difference, of course, between the guitar and the piano. I really appreciate the piano. When there is a guitar part, it seems like he has two kind of basic guitar patterns, one a little bit higher tempo and one a little bit lower, softer tempo, and he replaces the lyrics. I don't think that that has to be a weakness. I think that that can be a strength. However, I found it, after 2 hours, I found it a little repetitive because this was a live album. Therefore, it seemed like it got old a little bit. And so it's kind of on the fence there. It can be really strong, and it can also be detriment. I think most of the lows here that I felt were because it was a live album. I agree with y'all. I think that his speaking and interrupting himself when he was playing and his making noises about instrument sounds, speaking to the audience at times, I think his banter with the audience was really strong. And occasionally I found myself getting kind of frustrated, because I wanted to hear what he had to sing. And sometimes he would speak and I didn't feel like it was merited. Well, you could have not interrupted yourself and it could have been a stronger message to sing the song and say what you wanted to say in the song. There were a few times where he did spoken word, and there were a few times that he was just speaking to the audience, like when he said, talking to Hannah, this little girl, when what has love got to do with God? Love in heaven, when you're married, every day the rules change, only your wife knows the rules. He's just speaking. And a lot of those times I found, okay, that's interesting tidbits, but occasionally I found it as off the wall a little bit lyrically. Not bad, the message itself wasn't bad, but I guess what I'm saying is because it's a live album, it kind of gives a little picture of being disorganized, which is maybe his point. He may want it to be disorganized. It seemed like sometimes he was frustrated with the audience because of the clapping. You're clapping on the on beat, and therefore, that bleeds into the album, into the recording of the album. And, to an extent, that's okay because this is a live album. So I think that, and just the simplicity of his music, because it's just him and a guitar, or him and a piano, it can limit what he's able to do musically, so it rides solely on the lyrics. The lyrics I love throughout. I did think that those ideas got a little bit repetitive too, because when we're talking about rock and roll and music genre and dance, I'm totally on board with, I'm following him, I understand his critique, agree, but there were occasional times where I said, okay, yeah, that's what you talked about in the last song, and yep, I totally agree. It's just a little bit repetitive, I think. So
yeah, I think especially in the topic of like the end of the world type thing, which was especially in the 90s, there was a lot of focus on it. And so like as I listened to some of these songs, and some of them I loved even back in the day, but I think, it's not a super important topic for me now. And I love the song's beautiful and whatever, but I don't go around thinking about, hey, Jesus can come back any moment. I live my life in such a way that no matter when he comes back, he's pleased with the way I'm living and what I'm doing, but I'm not worried about, hey, y'all look busy because Jesus could come back at any moment, And I feel like that there was kind of a disconnect there with me also, specifically with kind of the end times, eschatological type things. But, he also has some quirky stuff like he's really against, and you see this come out, I think, in 2 songs. He's really against the space race, and sending people into space. And, of course, I disagree with that. But he has good reasons, for doing it, for saying that. And he feels like that the money could have been spent in a different place. But, there are things, too, like that I'm just like, yeah, that just doesn't really connect with me now. It may have been important, then, but it's not now.
So I think that actually is an interesting thing to consider when we go back to kind of one of our main questions that we've been talking about through this whole project. was God working in the life of Larry Norman, or was it, when you went to the concert, when you were listening to some of his music, like it was something specifically about how God was working in your life? It's a little bit of both. This is an interesting case because it's not just one album. It's not from like 2 or 3 years of Larry Norman's life. It's literally 30, 40 years of his music all put in one moment. But still, that live album is from over 20 years ago now. And so we're not just trying to mentally connect to the 1960s or the mid 70s or whatever, we're trying to connect to see what God has been doing in this guy's entire life. And so I think for me, that's where there were many low points on the album where I feel like I could say, like, I don't know, that wasn't impactful for me at all. I don't really know how to connect with that song anymore. But there were several other songs where I would say pretty clearly, like, okay, God was inspiring him to be able to communicate something important. And it still resonates today. And sure, there's stuff about the space race or stuff about, X, Y, or Z that maybe we could take that out and insert our own, topic today. But I still think that there are several songs in there that God was specifically working in his life, that it does communicate something deeply to us today.
So what would you say is the cultural relevance of this album for this generation in this specific time?
I think it's exactly what we were talking about earlier. I think this idea that, especially right now, okay, we're coming out of a pandemic, we think, although stuff is swinging back up all over the world as we're recording this right now. In the United States specifically, there have been riots because of race relations. There's been police brutality. There's been white supremacy. There's all this stuff going on that's being uncovered. People are on either side of different arguments, and it's chaos. It feels like there's no peace there.
And frankly, the church doesn't seem to be doing much about it.
It seems often very quiet. It does. And that's not to say everyone. I know many leaders that are active voices right now for truth, for justice, for peace. And man, I look up to them, men and women that I want to emulate Christ in the way that they do. I want to be like them because they're clearly following Christ. But at large, there's been a lot of silence. And I love exactly what we were talking about earlier in this album. I mean, we were talking about it in the Great American Novel, God Part 3. He brings it back to Christ. He brings it back to this idea of the Imago Dei. I mean, he doesn't say that, but that's the concept he's bringing up, that we are made in the image of God, and we ought to love others because they are made in the image of God. And that's genuine love. And then to think about what do we do? What does that mean? What does it mean to honor Christ and to bring justice in this situation? What does it mean to honor Christ and to care for the marginalized and the poor, the orphan, the widow, And so I think that's still just as important today, especially important right now as we move forward, because what could easily happen is there's outrage in the States, and there are protests, there's calls for change, there's all sorts of things. Some that are on one end of the spectrum, some that are on the opposite end of the spectrum, some that are more extreme in one way, some that are less extreme. But after a few months, it all kind of dies down. And it was this outrage culture, social media onslaught of saying we need to bring justice, specifically right now talking about, again, the racial tension, racial issues, racial injustice in the States, systemic racism, those kinds of ideas. I worry that regardless of what people are saying, regardless of who they are, that because it's not founded in Christ and this bedrock of true godly justice, that things will just fade because it's not popular to talk about it on social media anymore, or there's a new issue that is the hot button topic. And so now this other case, this other situation is forgotten, which means people are forgotten, which means people are left behind. People are just kind of left on the side. And so, yeah, I really do believe that, as Norman is saying, foundational to all of this conversation about justice, about caring for people, is our faith in Christ. So I think there are many organizations that are out there doing stuff like that right now, and organizations like the AND campaign. It's all rooted in Christ and in Scripture. in saying, okay, what does it mean to follow Christ and to seek justice in our country right now? And that's just one example. And I think that's super important for right now, just as it was in the 70s or 60s when stuff was written, when it was in the 90s when he sang it, 20 years later. It's still important.
Yeah, I agree. What do you think, Joseph? What's cultural relevance today?
I think that Larry Norman is relevant today still because he tends to expose false dichotomies in this album. He is exposing false dichotomies between being a Christian and being a part of the church and participating in cultural phenomena like rock and roll, like dance, certain types of dance, certain types of art. And he is exposing a false dichotomy between being a Christian and being a part of the environmental movement, and being a Christian and being in social justice. I think that he's saying that these three movements, the culture wars, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, with rock and roll, but not only rock and roll, with the environmental movement and with social justice, he's saying these things are not opposite of who God is and what God is doing, or who the church is or what the church is doing. These things are what God has called us to do, and if we see them as a false dichotomy, if we see them as false dichotomies, then we are mistaken.
And I think he's saying if we try to accomplish these things, whether it be civil rights or social justice in any other form, if we seek to accomplish it without Christ, then we've robbed it of any power for change. Because the power for true change the change has to come from within. It can't come from without. And so I think that that's what he's addressing, and he's addressing it to the church again and again. And I think it's what we need to hear. It's what we need to hear as a church today too. I agree.
Absolutely. He seems to be criticizing two groups, those who are secular without God but want to accomplish rock and roll, they want to accomplish environmentalism, they want to accomplish social justice, as you've mentioned, and church that wants to be church, that wants to follow God without dealing with any of these movements, without participating, without promoting these things, and seeing that God is in them, and seeing that God is there. God is in the care for the environment. The fact that acid rain is falling, the fact that nuclear bombs are falling or may be falling, the fact that the poor aren't getting fed, the fact that we're condemning dance even though David danced before the Lord. So he's saying these are not separable. God is in them, and that's how we see the value in these things, because God is there.
So I just want to point out, in regards to mentorship, these are the types of topics that we have to be discussing with our apprentices, because these are the questions they're asking. This is where the confusion lies. Whenever they look at the news and they read and they see, Black Lives Matter or one of these other organizations, and they see the church not doing the same thing, or they see the church ignoring or being quiet, or even people in the church saying opposite things, it's very confusing. And so whenever we're dealing with our apprentices, we have to be able to do what Larry did here, which is let's take this back to God's Word. Let's go back and let's look at what is the heart of God in these issues. And let's not be drawn away by somebody's tweet or what the news says or whatever. Let's have a solid foundation on and a focus on who God is and what his heart is, and his love for the hurting and his desire to bring justice to the world, but also recognizing that ultimately he's the one who brings justice. We are his agents of change, and we have to do that. But I think these are really important conversations that maybe most mentorship relationships we don't discuss these things for fear that maybe we disagree and then it's going to cause an argument and break the relationship. But that's where the mentor has to be able to be mature enough to be able to listen. And I've spoken with you guys. We have several singles on this team that are of a different generation than me, and we have differing opinions on these things. But the key has been, listen, you can share your side, but listen first. Make sure that you're listening and hearing and understanding and then considering, because you could be wrong. As a mentor, you could be wrong. You could have a tainted perspective because of the culture that you grew up in. But if you really want to have that depth of relationship with your apprentice, you have to listen. You have to listen to what's being said, consider, instead of just trying to argue and say, let me just try to prove to these guys my point. That's not mentorship. That's basically indoctrination, and that's a completely different thing. So just to kind of draw this back to mentorship and kind of point that out, I think it's important. I want to kind of finish up. Y'all have anything last that you want to say?
Yeah, I was just going to go back to what you were saying about the media. He has one song when he talks about the reporters, they listen to me, they take down what I say, and then they twist everything. So for this generation, which social media wasn't around in his day like it is today, it's important for us to remember to be drawn back to God and not necessarily receive all of our authority from these reporters, as he says in his songs, which is media all throughout these generations.
One of the best moments, I think, of this whole album was whenever he starts talking about how basically, specifically Christian media, was criticizing him and saying all these things, saying he's walked away from the Lord and that he's not a Christian anymore. And he says, and I started asking around, and I found out it's not true. Just confirming, I'm still a believer, whether you guys, affirm that or not. And I just thought, it was a really cool use of humor. I mean, imagine the whole Christian world saying that you're not a Christian.
Right.
But he handled it with such grace, and humor. And I thought that was really cool. And I think that whenever we're dealing with the media specifically, it's all doom and gloom, man. And we take everything so personal. And here we have Larry Norman, who was the target for all of that. And he takes it with grace, and he takes it with humor, and he doesn't basically, lash out or become a jerk about it. And I think there's something to learn there. So both for you guys and for anybody else who's listening, let me give you guys some recommendations for other albums. And I'm not so sure that the Vineyard is maybe the best place to start, but as I've already explained, the reasoning behind why I shared it with you guys. But his first album was called Upon This Rock, and it was the first Christian rock album. And it was very revolutionary, and it was popular both in Christian as well as secular circles, and it made him basically a superstar. But it's not my favorite. I do like his first album. I think it's cool, and it's got, some of the better versions of the songs that you heard on this album. But my favorite of all of them is called In Another Land, and it's got some of the, the songs that you guys mentioned that you love. It has a lot of their original, recorded versions. So it's a really good album. It's called In Another Land. And I think there's a recent new, what do you call it, whenever they redo it? Yeah, a remastered version that's come out recently, which is great. And then the third one that I would recommend is called Only Visiting This Planet. It's also a really good album. So if any of you guys want to check that out, I'll also tell you that there is a book out, which came out a couple of years ago, called Why Should the Devil Have All the Good Music? I haven't read it yet, but it's in my Amazon checkout box. I just haven't paid for it and downloaded it yet. So that's out there. So if you guys want to look more into Larry Norman, then that's where you should check it out. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks.